So our next speakers are our keynote speakers of the conference. They will be talking about an overview of clinical development of vaccines. She's Dr. Robin Wisch from the FDA and Mr. Richard Quartarone from the FDA. Dr. Robin Wisch joined the FDA's Division of Vaccines and Related Product Applications, Office of Vaccine Research and Review, as a medical officer in the clinical review branch in 2020. In this role, she provides analysis of clinical trial data for vaccines and related biologics. Associated with this primary function, Dr. Wisch reviews study designs and evaluates study reports for evidence of safety and effectiveness in support of biologic license applications. Prior to joining the FDA, she worked as a pediatrician for 15 years. Dr. Wisch obtained her medical degree from Mount Sinai School of Medicine and completed her pediatrics residency at the Yale New Haven Children's Clinic and is a board-certified pediatrician. Our joint presenter is Mr. Richard Quartarone, and he is a health communication specialist and acting team lead at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Here he supports patient-provider vaccine communication and helps health departments and partners build vaccine communication and confidence capacity. Richard has supported domestic immunization for 11 years and served on the CDC COVID-19 response for 2 years, initially as the senior press officer and later serving as the deputy director for communications on the CDC's COVID-19 vaccine task force. Richard joined the CDC in 2009 as a press officer. In addition to specializing in immunization, he worked in disease surveillance, public health informatics, scientific communication, and provider outreach. With 25 years of experience in public health, communication, and community organizing, Richard's career spans local and state public health departments, academic medicine, healthcare, public relations, journalism, web development, provider relations, community relations, and emergency preparedness. So let's give a big warm welcome to our featured speakers. Dr. Wisch, the floor is yours.
All right. I'm going to turn off. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you. I'm going to turn off my video because I think you're probably just looking at my slides. I think that'll make it a little easier on this end here. So as you've heard, my name is Robin Wisch, and I'm a clinical reviewer at FDA, and I have a background as a general pediatrician. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about the clinical development of vaccines and FDA's role in that process. Vaccines have been indispensable tools to prevent and control existing and emergent infectious diseases. The success of vaccines and public health vaccination programs has been demonstrated by their effect on many infectious diseases, such as the eradication of smallpox, the elimination of wild-type poliovirus paralytic disease in the United States, the low rates of measles, tetanus, and other vaccine-preventable diseases in the U.S., and the positive impact vaccines have had on the COVID-19 pandemic, just to name a few. Here, I've just listed some of the learning objectives for my presentation today. For today's talk, I'll start by going over some general background on FDA and its regulation of vaccines and other products in the United States. Then I'll discuss clinical vaccine development from the early stages before human clinical trials through the various clinical study phases onto vaccine licensure, and then the post-marketing phase once a vaccine has been approved and it is available to the public for use. And lastly, I'll touch on the differences between the approval of a vaccine and the authorization of a vaccine, as in the emergency use authorization that everyone is more aware of since COVID-19 and the pandemic. So we'll start by talking about some background on FDA, its organization, and its role in regulating vaccines. FDA's legal authority to regulate vaccines comes through laws passed by Congress. The two major acts in which FDA's authority lies are the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, or the FD&C Act, and the Public Health Service Act of 1944, also called the PHS Act. FDA implements these laws through regulations that are codified in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, which is known as the CFR. FDA also issues guidance documents, which are not binding, but they provide FDA's current thinking on a topic to help guide sponsors, investigators, manufacturers, and FDA staff. At the bottom of the slide, down here, are some of the major events, including laws that have been written and updated over time and events that have led to some of the earlier legislation. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this, but if you're interested in more detail on the history of FDA, you can go to the FDA's website on milestones in US FDA law, which I included on a list of references at the end of the slides that you'll all have if you don't already. This slide shows the organizational structure of FDA. At the top left are the centers that make up the FDA today. My work in vaccines is within CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. To the right, you can see some of the offices within CBER, including my office, the Office of Vaccines Research and Review, or OVRR. There's a lot of acronyms. OVRR is then shown at the bottom right and is made of several divisions, including DVRPA, which is the Division of Vaccines and Related Product Applications, which is where I work as a clinical reviewer of vaccines. And I work along with reviewers in DVP, which is the Division of Viral Products, and DVPAP, the Division of Bacterial, Parasitic, and Allergenic Products, who, in addition to being reviewers, are also laboratory-based scientists who conduct research on vaccine development. Lastly, at the bottom left are the review branches within DVRPA, including the clinical and regulatory review branches. OVRR, the Office of Vaccines Research and Review, OVRR's mission is to ensure the safety, purity, and potency, meaning effectiveness, of vaccines for human use in order to protect and enhance the public health. Now that we've gone over some basic background, we'll turn to the vaccine development and review process at FDA. There are multiple steps and many people involved in the review of an investigational vaccine prior to its approval. Vaccine review requires expertise from many disciplines, and this slide gives you an idea of how many people are part of the review team and how many different areas of expertise are required to ensure that a vaccine is both safe and effective before it's approved. Within CBER, reviewers come from many disciplines, as you can see on the left side of the slide. As a physician, I'm the clinical reviewer on the team, and I work with experts in all the other fields listed. In addition, reviewers in CBER, the Center for Biologics, may consult with experts in other centers within FDA. For example, we may consult specialists in different medical fields, such as cardiologists, OBGYNs, or gastroenterologists, and we look not only at the vaccine itself, but at the container it's supplied in and how it's delivered to the patient. So we work with laboratory scientists and device experts who look at the materials used to make all the parts of the vaccine, the syringe, the vial, the stoppers, and the caps. And we work with social scientists who look at the human factors that might affect the delivery of a vaccine at each step along the way. FDA also turns to outside experts, as you can see on the right side, such as the VRPAC, which is the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, which is made up of experts in infectious diseases, vaccines, and other related fields. FDA also involves patients and patient advocates and works with the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, that develops recommendations on the use of licensed vaccines in the United States. So now we'll go on to look at the stages of vaccine development. Before we go through the individual steps of the review process for vaccines, I would just want to make sure that everyone recognizes that most investigational products, including vaccines, which make up a subset of drugs and biologics that are developed for human use, that these products start the developmental process. Most of them, or many of them, don't make it through all the way to licensure down at the bottom of this funnel. There is a lot of attrition that occurs along the way. So many investigational products or vaccines don't even make it to the stage of FDA review over here, which is the point at which we start trials in human participants. And once under FDA review during the clinical trials, there are still many that don't make it past those phases of clinical trials and on to licensure. This slide presents an overview of the stages of vaccine development and review, from vaccine concept on the left through to the post-marketing period on the right, which continues throughout the life of every licensed vaccine. And we'll return to this diagram throughout the different review process phases. FDA approval of a vaccine is based on data from preclinical development through phase 3 clinical development. Over the next several slides, we'll go through the highlights of each of these steps of vaccine development, starting with the pre-IND phase. The preclinical development stage, shown in the yellow box on the left, is when research and discovery happen. It's when a rationale for a vaccine is developed based on how the virus or bacteria causes disease in humans. The investigational vaccine is tested in the laboratory, including safety and immunogenicity studies, prior to administering the vaccine to humans in clinical trials. This is also the time when the manufacturing process is developed to ensure that investigational vaccines are sterile, pure, potent, and manufactured consistently from lot to lot. Once there's non-clinical pharmacology and toxicology information and chemistry, manufacturing, and controls information that may support the progression to clinical, meaning human studies, a sponsor can request what's called a pre-IND meeting to ask FDA to address specific questions and provide advice prior to submitting an investigational new drug or IND application. An IND is required to conduct human trials, as we'll go over next after this. Under pre-IND, before the IND submission, a sponsor presents their preclinical data, their manufacturing and product information, and their clinical development plans in order to receive feedback from FDA on what will be necessary for their IND submission and to initiate any human trials. And just a little side note, I've used the word sponsor, and I'll be using that throughout the pre-marketing phases of the vaccine development. It's defined in the regulations in the CFR that I mentioned, and it refers, according to the definition in the regulations, as the entity who takes responsibility for and initiates a clinical investigation. The sponsor can be an individual, such as a physician. It can be a pharmaceutical company, like the drug companies that you know all their names of from all the medications and vaccines that you administer and prescribe. It can be a governmental agency like NIH or CDC, an academic institution, or other organizations. They're all referred to as the sponsor during the IND phase. So now we'll move from the pre-IND stage of preclinical development to the IND stage of clinical development, which begins with an initial IND submission, which is shown as this red arrow on the left. And this initial IND submission is usually for a phase 1 clinical protocol, and it's frequently a first-in-human clinical trial, and we'll talk about that. So prior to starting clinical trials for an investigational vaccine, there must be an IND. So what actually is an IND, and why is it necessary in order to conduct studies in human participants? So as I said, IND stands for Investigational New Drug. But this term also refers to vaccines. And since our discussion's about vaccines, that's what we'll be talking about. The primary purpose of an IND is to protect the safety and rights of human research participants. And this is true for all phases of clinical trials. Review of an IND also assures the quality of the scientific evaluation is adequate to permit evaluation of effectiveness and safety. Essentially, from a legal standpoint, an IND exempts a study from the federal laws that prohibit the introduction of unapproved vaccines into interstate commerce by allowing the legal shipment of that investigational product in order to conduct the clinical trials. So now we'll go through each of the phases of clinical or human trials, starting with phase 1. As the first trials of investigational vaccines conducted in humans, the primary objective of phase 1 trials is safety. These are small trials, generally including 20 to about 100 healthy adult participants with very close safety monitoring, including assessment of solicited, meaning specifically asked about local and systemic reactions, like injection site redness or swelling, fever, muscle aches, nausea, and other events that commonly occur within the first days after vaccination, as well as unsolicited adverse events that occur within about a month after vaccination, and serious and other medically attended adverse events that occur through the end of the study or for at least 6 months after the last vaccination. Safety assessments include not only the presence of adverse events, but their causality and the severity of the events. This data is collected in many different ways through diary cards that study participants complete, physical exams, clinical laboratory assessments like blood work, and follow-up phone calls and office visits. There are predefined rules in the study protocol for when a study must be stopped due to any kind of a safety concern, as well as stopping rules for the individual participants. In addition to safety, these studies may also start to explore vaccine dose levels and schedules, look at vaccines maybe with and without an adjuvant to determine the optimal formulation, and gather some preliminary immunogenicity data. Study objectives and endpoints tend to be descriptive rather than hypothesis tested in phase 1. The results of these phase 1 studies inform the study design of phase 2 and 3 studies and which dose levels, formulations, and schedules will advance in the clinical development program. Now we'll move to phase 2 clinical development. While safety was the primary objective of phase 1 trials, both immunogenicity and safety are the primary objectives of phase 2 trials. So we're moving on now to the end of phase 2 meeting, which occurs prior to moving on to phase 3, and as we're ending up some of the phase 2 studies. And it's between the sponsor and FDA so that the sponsor can plan for for their clinical studies in phase 3 that will ultimately provide definitive support for vaccine safety and effectiveness that is required for approval of the vaccine. Similar to the pre-IND meeting, the sponsor presents available data and proposed clinical development plans to FDA and asks specific questions in order to get feedback and advice from FDA, this time prior to initiating phase 3 trials planned to support eventual licensure. That brings us to the last phase of pre-marketing clinical development, phase 3. The primary objective of phase 3 trials is to demonstrate vaccine efficacy, along with further evaluation of safety in an even larger safety database, which provides greater potential to pick up less common safety signals, and there's continued collection of immunogenicity data. Phase 3 trials are most commonly blinded, randomized, controlled trials. Predefined clinical disease case definitions are established for the evaluation of efficacy, and pre-specified hypothesis testing and success criteria, particularly for the primary efficacy endpoint, is used. Phase 3 trials have much larger populations, usually with thousands of participants, sometimes tens of thousands of participants, and these participants reflect the population in whom the vaccine is intended for use. A pre-BLA meeting is held towards the end of phase 3 and prior to the sponsor's submission of a BLA, which stands for the Biologics License Application, in order to give the sponsor the opportunity to provide a summary of the clinical data and the product and manufacturing information, to present their BLA submission plans, and to identify any unresolved issues that occurred during IND review, and to get FDA's feedback. Before we turn to talking about the BLA, I just want to take a moment to mention a couple of additional points about the review process under INDs. For the first point on pediatrics, since I am a pediatrician, first, to address the historical problem of there being inadequate information in pediatric population, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA, was an amendment to the FD&C Act in 2003, and there have been updates to it since then. But PREA requires that applications include safety and effectiveness data in pediatric populations. Deferrals and waivers of this requirement are allowed under certain circumstances that are delineated and defined in the regulations, the CFR, but a pediatric study plan must be submitted under an IND within 60 days after that end of phase 2 meeting that we talked about. The other point I want to make, which I mentioned earlier, is that much of FDA's feedback to sponsors is in the form of recommendations, not requirements. However, FDA can issue what's called a clinical hold to a sponsor of an IND that delays the start of a proposed clinical trial or suspends an ongoing clinical trial for some of the reasons outlined here, such as if there is an unreasonable or significant risk to the study participants, there's a finding that any of the investigators aren't qualified, there's either misleading, erroneous, or insufficient information, or there's something about the study design that is inadequate to meet the objectives of the study. So now we'll go on to the BLA, or the Biologics License Application. The BLA is essentially a request for permission to distribute and market the vaccine. So the person or the entity that we've been calling the sponsor now becomes referred to as the applicant. A BLA submission can be thousands of pages, even tens of thousands of pages long, with lots of data and summary and information. And it includes preclinical and clinical data, details of the manufacturing process and facility information, as well as financial disclosure forms and conflict of interest forms for the study investigators. The applicant must demonstrate that the vaccine is safe, pure, and potent, meaning effective as defined in the CFR. And down here, the safety, purity, and potency, these are definitions that come straight from the regulations, summarized here, and making sure that the product is manufactured consistently to ensure safety and effectiveness. The FDA review team includes physicians like myself, as well as chemists, statisticians, data analysts, pharmacologists and toxicologists, microbiologists, experts in post-marketing safety, so pharmacovigilance reviewers and epidemiologists. There are clinical study site and manufacturing and facility site inspectors, and labeling and communications experts. As I mentioned earlier, in some cases, FDA also requests input from the VRPAC, that advisory committee. That's an independent and external panel of experts. Part of BLA review includes review of the USPI, which is the United States Prescribing Information. It's also referred to as the PI, and PI can stand for that prescribing information or provider information or package insert. Sometimes it's called the label, so there are lots of names for it, but that's that large pamphlet that comes in every vaccine package that you receive. So here's an example of a label. This label, all labels are divided into a highlight section, as you can see at the top left of the slide, and a full prescribing information section, which is preceded by the table of contents for that full prescribing information. And it's all done using a standard format so that it provides consistent and relevant information to healthcare providers. So whenever you look at a label, no matter what it's for, it will be organized in the same way with the same sections. The PI is written by the applicant and reviewed by FDA during the BLA review process to assure that it adequately and accurately reflects the approved indication, usage, dosing, and administration for the vaccine. As you can see in the table of contents for the full prescribing information down here at the bottom right, the PI also includes other sections: contraindications, warnings and precautions, adverse reaction data from clinical trials, and if it's a product that's already on the market, there's also post-marketing experience. There's information on use in specific populations, such as pregnant individuals or immunocompromised individuals, and there's storage and handling information, along with other information for healthcare providers. The PI also forms the basis for what the manufacturer is allowed to say in their promotional and marketing materials. So countless hours are spent making sure that all the important and necessary information to safely and effectively use the vaccine is communicated to healthcare providers in this PI. In addition to being included in the packaging that you receive, all current USPIs are available online through the FDA's website that's shown here down at the bottom. And again, at the end of the slide in the references, I have this link listed as well. It's a very helpful site. So now we'll move into the post-approval or post-marketing phase of vaccine development. Back to our diagram. So we've gone from preclinical development and the pre-IND meeting to the IND submission and the 3 clinical trial phases of pre-marketing clinical development to submission and review of the BLA. And at this point, if a vaccine is approved, it enters into the post-marketing phase, which continues for as long as the vaccine is licensed. The post-marketing phase may include additional clinical trials, and it definitely includes safety monitoring. As with many products on the market, not just medical products, over time, there are changes and updates that are necessary. So even after all the clinical trials conducted under IND, there may be additional clinical trials conducted post-marketing to address safety or efficacy questions raised in phase 3 studies, to further investigate potential risks, or to study the vaccine in different populations. Applicants may decide to conduct additional trials on their own initiative, or trials may be part of commitments the applicant made prior to approval, or they may be requirements that were a condition for approval. Post-marketing commitments, or PMCs, are studies the applicant has agreed to. For example, to explore the duration of protection of a vaccine, or to study the vaccine in a particular subpopulation, such as immunocompromised individuals. Post-marketing requirements, or PMRs, just like it sounds, are required studies. For example, a pediatric study that's required under PREA but was deferred until after safety and efficacy was established in an adult population would count as a PMR. Also, a PMR could be required if there was some concern about a safety signal. In addition to active surveillance through the post-marketing studies, there are other forms of active surveillance as well as passive surveillance to continually monitor safety for licensed vaccines. There are multiple programs in place to collect and review safety data, such as through the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, in which anyone, including yourselves or your patients, can report an adverse event. There are also data monitoring systems linked to electronic health data that are indicated by these red names on the slide. And again, I have linked to those at the end. In addition to monitoring for adverse events, there are also ongoing routine manufacturing inspections. There's required regular lot release testing done, and annual reports are submitted for FDA review that summarize the preclinical and clinical findings, any manufacturing changes, and future plans for the product. Of course, there can be changes post-licensure, like I mentioned, such as new efficacy data from clinical trials that were conducted post-marketing, or new safety data from post-marketing use of the product. There may also be changes to the manufacturing process or facilities over time. New data may then support changes to the prescribing information, such as to extend the age indication, to update the adverse reaction section, or to add a new indication. Post-approval changes, whether due to updates in efficacy, to immunogenicity, or to safety data, changes to the label or manufacturing changes, those are all submitted as an sBLA or a supplement to the BLA for FDA review. And that review process is similar to the process for the initial BLA. So finally, we're going to look at vaccine approval and authorization. As we talked about under BLAs, an approval amounts to permission for the applicant to distribute and market a vaccine in the United States. All approved indications for vaccines must be supported by substantial evidence of effectiveness. The demonstration of effectiveness is based on adequate and well-controlled clinical studies in which objectives and analysis methods are pre-specified. The study design includes an investigational vaccine group and a control group, randomization to study groups, and blinding, and there are well-defined and reliable methods to assess the vaccine's response. Approval of a BLA means that the applicant met the requirements to demonstrate safety, purity, and potency of the vaccine, and the ability to manufacture the vaccine consistently to ensure continued safety and effectiveness. An emergency use authorization, or EUA, is a mechanism to facilitate the availability and use of a medical product, such as a vaccine, during a public health emergency. Under an EUA, FDA may allow the use of unapproved medical products or allow unapproved use of an approved medical product in an emergency to address serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions when certain statutory criteria have been met, including that there are no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. Once an EUA request is submitted, FDA evaluates the request to determine whether the criteria have been met. Just as for a BLA submission, an EUA request requires non-clinical, clinical, and manufacturing data. Before an EUA can be issued, phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials conducted under IND need to generate the data required to determine safety and effectiveness, along with adequate manufacturing information to ensure quality and consistency, so that FDA can then determine whether the known and potential benefits of the medical product outweigh the known and potential risks. Post-authorization safety monitoring, just as post-marketing safety monitoring, is continuous and uses the same surveillance systems. Information is shared with healthcare providers in fact sheets rather than in the USPI, but with the same relevant and required information. Under EU request in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the scientific standards, integrity of the review process, and safety were upheld to the same standards as for a BLA approval. Efforts to accelerate vaccine development focused on prioritizing development of the most promising vaccines, federal government investment in the needed manufacturing capacity at no risk to the drug manufacturers, and collaboration among government agencies, international regulatory agencies, academia, nonprofit organizations, and pharmaceutical companies. At the bottom of the slide, and included again at the references at the end, there's an informative link to the FDA website that explains emergency use authorization for vaccines in a bit more detail if you're interested. So in summary, to review what we've covered, we went over some background on FDA and its authority to regulate vaccines, which comes from federal laws like the FD&C Act and the PHS Act, legislated by Congress, and applied through specific regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, that address clinical study requirements, standards for safety and effectiveness, manufacturing consistency, licensing, and product labeling. We mentioned the mission of the Office of Vaccines to ensure the safety, purity, potency, and effectiveness of vaccines for human use in order to protect and enhance the public health. We walked through the vaccine approval process and CBER's role to evaluate information and data from preclinical and human trials, to assess study design, ensure adherence to ethical and scientific quality standards, confirm assay validation and product manufacturing information, along with statistical analyses, and to conduct clinical site and manufacturing facility inspections, all with the objective to make sure a vaccine is safe and effective for its intended use, that the label provides adequate directions for use, and that the manufacturing is adequate to maintain consistency. We then talked about what happens after a vaccine is licensed, including additional clinical trials, ongoing safety monitoring, and regular manufacturing review. And lastly, we discussed vaccine approval and emergency use authorization, both of which require intensive review by experts in many fields to review data to determine whether the benefits outweigh the risks to assure that a vaccine is, again, safe, pure, and potent, and is being manufactured consistently. So on this slide and the next, I just included links that I've mentioned along the way, as well as some additional informative and helpful links for you. And I just want to say a thank you to those who have helped me put this presentation together. So thank you for your time and attention. I'll stop sharing my screen now so Richard can go ahead and start his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Wisch.
Thank you.
Next, Mr. Quartarone will discuss the CDC's role in development of vaccinations. The floor is yours, Richard.
Great, thank you. Excellent. So thanks, everyone. And I am really going to talk about it from the point of view of how science and innovations really get implemented, get adopted, and take it very much from that perspective. I think it's important to understand that a new product, a new thing that comes out, is not just sort of immediately adopted. And when something is licensed, like a vaccine, everybody doesn't know exactly how to use it, and how it should be given, the timing, all of those other things. And there's a lot of nuance that goes into the implementation, the practice around vaccination. And that is where CDC comes in. And first, I want to frame all of this and particularly my portion of the presentation, as well as Dr. Wisch's portion of the presentation, that vaccine confidence is fundamentally built on trust. And when it's very easy to think about it as, oh, it's the vaccine. It's just the vaccine we're thinking, but it really isn't. It has to do with the providers, the situation, the environment where vaccinations are given, and the interaction that somebody has with the provider, as well as all of the processes, all of the policies that lead to vaccine development, authorization, licensure, manufacturing, and all of the recommendations for use. So when we talk about vaccine confidence, when we talk about the work that we're doing, anything that goes wrong in the process leading up to the point or even after the point that somebody gets vaccinated, anywhere in that process can harm trust and potentially reduce vaccine confidence, reduce vaccine demand. And we've seen examples of this in the US, and we've seen examples of this in other parts of the world, particularly. So our system in the United States is really very impressive for the approval, rollout, and maintenance of vaccine safety. the really kind of starting with the different components that we just talked about from FDA, as well. And I'm going to focus very heavily on the central component of this, which is how the recommendations are given. And I'll mention a little bit about vaccine safety monitoring. So again, we're going to start with really the handoff from when something is licensed. When something is licensed to when something becomes recommended and part of the immunization schedule. And with CDC, it starts with the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practice. And the Advisory Committee, ACIP, is a group of individuals who are not affiliated with the government. Many of them are from organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Academy of Family Physicians, but there's also members and individuals who represent consumers. But there's a lot of experts really going in and looking at all of the licensure information and considering a lot of different things. The first thing always, when we're talking about a new product coming to market, a new medical product, is looking at the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine and in the context of when it's given to the specific ages that they're looking at. So some vaccines are given for adults, some are for children, and looking at the safety and effectiveness for those groups at the times that they are given based on the licensure information. Also looking at the severity of disease. So often medical procedures are really seen in very much a cost benefit sort of way or risk benefit perspective. So understanding the severity of the disease, as well as the effectiveness and safety of the vaccine, and how the vaccine can help reduce the severity of the disease in the population and in the individual. So it's understanding vaccines as both a population-based public health intervention and an individual health choice and medical procedure. It is a really challenging, interesting balance in all of these conversations. And the ECIP really is one of the places where we as public health practitioners really navigate through those two distinctions and those two areas of focus when we're looking at public health interventions and vaccines in particular. The number, also look at the number of people who get the disease if there is no vaccine. So this really kind of connects to the severity of the disease and how well the vaccine works for people in different ages. So if it's a lifespan vaccine like or across multiple age groups, a vaccine like Tdap or a vaccine like COVID vaccine or flu vaccine, it may work differently in different age groups depending on the individual's immune systems and how they respond to the vaccines. So understanding that really helps guide how the recommendation goes and for whom that specific vaccine product is recommended. And then how practical the recommendations are to put into practice. Because if there's a wonderful vaccine, but it is very difficult to administer, and there are a lot of barriers to doing it, really have to consider that in the implementation, because if there's not somebody who can vaccinate in the community, if people don't have access to the vaccine, if it's not convenient, if there's a major learning curve for providers, we have to consider that in the process because that will affect uptake, viability of the vaccination process. So once ACIP has made their recommendation, done their review, there is a published recommendation in the MMWR. And once that recommendation is published, that is when CDC makes their recommendation. So essentially, the ACIP advises CDC, and the CDC director ultimately makes the decision about what to adopt in terms of the recommendation. So, and all of the advisory committees, CDC recommendations, once they are published, are kept online, and you can go back through all of the ACIP recommendations by year or by vaccine specific. So each recommendation, each time it is changed, there is a new publication about it, and those are online. And again, all of this in FDA process, our process, all of these rules is to make it very transparent, very clear, and very easy to follow so that there's accountability in all of this. And once the recommendations are adopted, they go on the vaccine schedule. And the vaccine schedule is, as you guys know, you're probably very familiar with it, really is a compilation of all the recommendations really put into a lifespan or into different individual or population groups. So somebody has age is the most common, but there's also health conditions or work risk that might make somebody more likely to have the vaccine recommended for them, and schedules broken up into those ways. It's also broken up into catch-up vaccination. So when vaccines are given, how they're given, can you give them on the same day? And the schedule and flow of that, of when the vaccines are effective, are all broken up into that schedule. The schedule, particularly for the childhood immunization, is aligned with, as you know, one of the things that's really great about the schedule and about how we do recommendations, it's aligned with when people are visiting in the first 3 years of life, when children are being brought in for their regular well child visits. And so that maximizes resources and creates a default where parents come in and they get to the point where they expect vaccines when they come into the provider's office. The children expect vaccines as they get older. And it's part of the normalization and understanding of the process. So it's a very thoughtful process that of how they work together to really kind of build this out. And all of these things then after that go into a number of clinical resources and clinical practice resources that we have developed, including trainings, job aids, specific resources for long-term care, the Vaccines for Children program, storage and handling requirements, and best practices. And all of these resources, trainings, and other things for clinical practice are available online and through all of these sites, which are also at the end of the presentation so that you guys can have them. But one of this resource library is a great one because it has all of the videos that we have in terms of trainings and other things that you can just scroll through and use. But there's also the You Call the Shot series. There's because there are a number of different series for different audiences, kind of based on where you are in a clinic setting. If you're a nurse or a PA versus a doctor, and how you do the role that you play in administering and maintaining the safety and effectiveness of the vaccination after it's gone through all of that licensing process, making sure that when it is in the real world, the safety of the vaccine is maintained. And again, I will reiterate, and I'll actually read this. I don't usually like reading from slides, but this is taken from an infographic that we have about where we've taken these sort of three boxes of how we think about vaccination. The United States has the safest vaccine supply in history, and the vaccines that we have keep our children, families, communities protected from serious disease. And making sure that that system, those vaccines are safe, continue to be safe, is really what this entire process is about, and making sure that it's transparent. I'll give another plug for VAERS, and making sure that tools like VAERS provide for those of us in the federal government or manufacturers have a really great feedback loop where we can get data from the source, get it in close to real time, and find out exactly what's going on and have that help inform how everything post-licensure and post-activation, if something is going wrong, we can find it quickly and address it. And that part of it is incredibly important. The example I will use is from American Samoa in 2018. American Samoa had a situation where there was a vaccine administration error that caused a couple of children to die. And in the process of the follow-up with the administration error, it wasn't documented well, it wasn't reported well, and when people found out about it, it was covered up. The clinic tried to cover it up or reacted in not a positive way. The individuals didn't necessarily acknowledge initially what had happened, and the public saw the government as being complicit in that. And the MMR vaccination coverage in American Samoa dropped significantly. It became a calling point for anti-vaccination efforts. Many anti-vaccine people met with the president, and a year or two later, guess what happened? There was an enormous measles outbreak that killed dozens of children, and seeing that is what then again sort of created a major MMR vaccination effort in that country. And until recently, they really hadn't had another outbreak, but they're now reporting probable cases of measles in American Samoa, and there's still some lingering trust issues and some challenges there. So at the center of all of this, every piece of this process is really meant to ensure
Richard,
effective vaccinations and trust in the system. And with that, I will share a number of resources. We have a new video about ACIP on YouTube. The link is here, but we have all of the number of direct links to the resources that I included, as well as some summary links as well. So thank you.